Okay, this is Emergence of the U.S. as a World Power Part 7, and I think we just sank the main, and I wanted to go back to that just a little bit. The Spanish authorities investigated the wreck and did not find any evidence of foul play. The U.S. Navy investigated the wreck, and the report stated that the cause of the explosion was, and these are the words of the report, a submarine torpedo. Were there submarines in 1898? Well, yes, in a very, very early stage of development. But they don't mean, the captain looking through the periscope, fire one. That's not what it was. A torpedo was any kind of explosive device that was projected, maybe on a pole, something like that. And the word submarine was also an adjective. If something was below the surface of the water, it was submarine. The Navy did not report that the Spanish had sunk the ship, just that it was done by an external explosive device. Okay. But the U.S. public assumed that the Spanish had done this. Something like 266 officers and men were killed in this explosion. And some artist did a sketch that was printed in newspapers all over the country. It's got the ship blowing up, big explosion, got the sailors flying up in the sky, and you just hear, "There's little Johnny." You get the idea. It was um, and designed to be inflammatory. So we take it from there. The wreck was refloated in something like 1922, towed out into deep water, and they sank it again just to get it out of the way. It was a hazard navigation in the harbor. The Navy investigated it again and confirmed the earlier diagnosis. In 1978, there was a third investigation. They knew where the wreck was. It wasn't, terribly inaccessible. And this time they reversed it. They noted that the hull plating where the explosion had occurred was bent outward. The explosion was inside the ship. This is not hard to explain. All right. Hardly a year went by in those days that some ship didn't just blow up somewhere. It didn't seem to need a reason. It's just this one blew up, wrong place, wrong time, very suspicious circumstances. You see, these ships ran on coal. They store the coal in coal bunkers. And when the coal has all been shoveled out, you have an enclosed space containing coal dust. Coal dust in an enclosed space is about as explosive as gasoline, and one spark and that ship's going to be a goner. That's almost certainly what happened here. Okay. It was a forward coal bunker, one bulkhead away from where they stored the big bags of black powder they used to fire the big guns in the forward battery. It's going to happen. Well, nonetheless. Okay, President McKinley held off as long as he could, but in April he asked Congress to pass a resolution setting a deadline, an ultimatum, giving Spain until May 1st to agree to withdraw its forces from Cuba and let the United States assist the Cubans then in finding independence. Um, if Spain has not agreed to do that by that date, hostilities would commence. Spain immediately rejected the ultimatum and declared war on the United States on something like, I believe it was April 21st. The United States reciprocated. So we are at war with Spain. Okay. The first battle of the war, and this must have been alarming to, I'm going to call them isolationists. The word anti-imperialist would work, because there'd been people, probably a majority all along in the United States, who really were not interested in or sympathetic to the, rainbows and unicorns dreams of these imperialists in our midst. But there was no question on the table to be answered. So it was all just a fantasy and what if. With Cuba, there was a question to be answered, and that awakened the isolationists. And to get the resolution through Congress, the one setting the deadline, you had to compromise with those guys because they could block it. They would have. But an amendment was added to it called the Teller Amendment, named for the congressman who added it on there. And the Teller Amendment was a self-denying declaration where the United States declared that we would not be waging the war for the purpose of annexing Cuba or extending any kind of permanent political control over that island. The isolationists did not draw a big enough box, metaphorically speaking, around the problem, as we shall see. But the first battle was fought halfway around the world in Manila Bay on the east coast of the Philippine Islands, which are just off from, like, I believe, Vietnam out there. And the Spanish fleet was in Manila, which had been a Spanish possession since the early 1520s, almost 500 years. Something like that. Almost 400 years. And the U.S. Pacific Squadron, I think there were only 6 ships, when the war started, they were in Hong Kong, which was a British possession on the coast of China. And Theodore Roosevelt plays a part here. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy at a time when the job of Secretary of the Navy was seen as largely ceremonial, and the Secretary of the Navy was usually out playing golf, leaving Roosevelt pretty much run the place. And he typed out on a typewriter with his own 10 fingers an order to Admiral II.A, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to steam down to Manila Bay and be prepared to engage the Spanish in the event of hostilities commencing. It's also been found that President McKinley himself signed off on the order, but it's also known that the British were interested in the Philippines. They're still aggressive. So this is a complex multiplayer situation. Anyway, Dewey heads down there, and on the morning of May 1st, he took his ships in a rather daring move into Manila Bay. Now, he has to sail past some high cliffs with powerful forts with big guns, and the guns never spoke. The Spanish had never been at war out there. They're basically asleep. They may not have known the war had begun. But either the guns weren't properly mounted, or there's no ammo, or nobody knew how to fire them. And the Spanish commander, very unwisely, and by the way, our ships were modern steel ships with steam engines. His ships were wooden ships. They probably had steam engines too, but you don't want to be on the wrong side of that fight. He hauled up his anchors and headed out into the bay to meet our fleet in open water. And if our crews had been any better at their gunnery than they actually were, it would have been done a lot quicker. But all the Spanish ships were systematically sunk. The American fleet suffered no casualties at all. Well, the public is ecstatic about the news, and patriotism soars to new heights. Dewey did not have enough Marines aboard his ships to make a landing. Now, the Filipinos, like the Cubans, had been eager for independence, and they assumed that Dewey had come as a liberator. So they would greet him as such. They're going to be bitterly disappointed a few more months down the line. So Dewey and his fleet sat there from May 1st to nearly the middle of August before the Army got enough troops out there to go ashore and start taking possession. And even then, it wasn't settled what we're going to do with the Philippines. Meanwhile, a German fleet appears and a British fleet appears, and either one of those could have done to us about what we just did in the Spanish. It was very tense. The German fleet was sending surveying crews ashore. Now, this is a world of unbridled, unapologetic imperialism. It's just snatch grab what you can snatch grab. And the assumption was the Germans were interested in this, and we might have to fight them for it. We didn't. And it wasn't until after World War II that their secret papers came to light. They were not planning to elbow us aside, but if we didn't want the Philippines, they by golly did. So there you go. Would we have been doing the Filipinos a favor turning them over to the tender mercies of the Germans. Think about it. Okay. All right. In the U.S., I posted two little short documentaries. They'd come at it from different angles. I think they're both informative about the Spanish-American War. Apparently, there's some fighting around Guantanamo Bay, where we still have a base today. But pretty much the next big event came when another Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Cervera, was reportedly heading west across the Atlantic, terrified the whole East Coast. Everybody's so scared that Cervera is going to steam up out of the mist and blow us all to oblivion. He somehow managed to get past the American Atlantic Fleet and made his way in safety to Santiago de Cuba, which is a seaport right about the middle of that flat southern coast of Cuba. Okay, and dropped anchor there. What followed was a land campaign to dislodge the Spanish fleet from Santiago. Okay, whereas our Navy had been ready for a war, our Army was not. The entire U.S. Army contained about 28,000 officers and men who had not seen any action since the Indian Wars ended years earlier. It had been 33 years since the end of the Civil War. Okay? That's quite a while. The Spanish may have had at least 100,000 men in Cuba. So they could have held out, but it's not, the situation is not good for them. Anyway, men lined up to join as volunteers. And enter again Theodore Roosevelt. He's got a safe, cushy desk job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he loves everything about ships and that kind of thing. But he took an extremely risky career move. He resigned the Assistant Navy Secretary job, pulled some political strings, and got himself a commission as a colonel of volunteers in the U.S. Army, and was assigned to be the second in command of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, which came to be better known as the Rough Riders. So Roosevelt took a train down to San Antonio, Texas, set up shop in the bar at the Menger Hotel, which still stands a block from the Alamo, and began signing up real live Western cowboys. Roosevelt spoke their language. He had been a cattle rancher in the Dakotas back in the mid to late 1880s. He had earned the respect of men like that. He's living in two worlds. So, and the public was just enthralled. The real cowboys signing up to fight the Cubans. Enthralled enough that several of men who flew at Roosevelt's social and educational rank, Ivy Leaguers from back east, they showed up and they joined the Rough Riders too. And this is fascinating. Men from totally different social strata coming to know each other and respect each other and fight together as brothers in arms. There was a sergeant whose father had been the Secretary of State. Okay. Anyway, they took a train to, after they trained near San Antonio, they got on a train and rode to, I think, Pensacola, Florida, where the Army was going to embark for Cuba. There wasn't room on the ships for their horses, so I had to leave them behind. So when they got to Cuba, Roosevelt's Rough Riders became Wood's Weary Walkers because their commanding officer was General Leonard Wood, who would later be the commanding officer of the whole U.S. Army. I've got to patch this onto the other. I'll come back in part 8.